"I see something in you that you don't see in yourself." That's what Milton Greene told Marilyn Monroe in 1953 during their first photography session for Look magazine. She was 27 years old, already famous for the white dress blowing over the subway grate, already trapped in Fox's 7-year contract that treated her like studio property. And this photographer, this artist who'd shot everyone from Audrey Hepburn to Marlene Dietrich, was looking at her like she was more than a commodity. "You're not just a glamour model," Greene insisted, adjusting the lighting in ways that made her face look almost sculptural. "You're an actress, an artist, and Hollywood is wasting you." Nobody had ever said that to her before. Directors told her to be sexy, studios told her to lose weight, lovers told her to be grateful for the fame, but Milton Greene saw something else, a business partner, an equal, someone worth risking everything for. So when she showed up at his Connecticut farmhouse in December 1954, running from Fox and desperate for a way out, he didn't just offer shelter, he offered power. "We'll form a production company," he said, sitting at his kitchen table while his wife Amy made coffee and their young son played nearby. "Marilyn Monroe Productions. You'll own 51%, I'll own 49%, and we'll force Fox to renegotiate your contract on your terms." It was revolutionary, insane, the kind of move that could destroy both their careers. But Greene mortgaged his house to fund it, spent the next 3 years fighting Fox in court, producing Bus Stop and The Prince and the Showgirl, securing Marilyn's creative freedom in ways the studio system had never allowed. They did 50 photography sessions together, thousands of images that showed the world she was more than a sex symbol, she was art, and for 3 years, she was free. Then Arthur Miller convinced her it was all a lie, that Greene was stealing from her, using her name to cover his debts, exploiting her the way every man in Hollywood exploited her. So in 1957 she signed the papers dissolving their partnership, bought out Greene's 49% stake, ended the only business relationship where she'd ever been the majority owner. And they didn't speak for 5 years. 5 years of pills and failed marriages and films that proved she was a great actress but never again gave her creative control. 5 years of men making decisions for her while she spiraled toward August 5, 1962. But in the final weeks before her death, Marilyn made one last phone call to the photographer who'd seen her as art instead of commodity, to the partner who'd given her 51% when Hollywood only offered slavery. "Milton," she whispered, her voice barely recognizable, "I should have listened to you." And Milton Greene, sitting in his Connecticut home surrounded by thousands of photographs of a woman he'd tried to save, could only say what both of them already knew. "I know, Marilyn, I know." Before we dive deeper into this untold story of partnership, betrayal, and the phone call that came 5 years too late, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We're uncovering the hidden truths behind Hollywood's most iconic figures, the stories the studios never wanted you to know. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about Marilyn Monroe. 1953 was supposed to be just another photo shoot. Look magazine had hired Milton Greene to capture Marilyn Monroe at the height of her fame. She'd just finished Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, the film that cemented her status as Hollywood's ultimate sex symbol. Everyone loved Marilyn Monroe the fantasy, but nobody was asking what Norma Jean wanted. Milton Greene was different from the start. While other photographers positioned her like a mannequin, Greene actually talked to her, asked about her dreams, her frustrations, the roles she wanted to play that Fox kept denying her. Greene had built his career photographing the most beautiful women in the world, but he approached Marilyn differently. He saw past the platinum blonde hair and the calculated vulnerability. "She would come to my studio and we'd talk for hours before I even picked up the camera," Greene later recalled. "She wasn't the giggling blonde everyone expected. She was reading Dostoevsky, studying at the actor's studio, fighting for dramatic roles that Fox refused to give her." The photographs from those early sessions revealed something the public had never seen. Marilyn in character costumes borrowed from studio wardrobes, playing different personas, exploring emotional ranges that her films never allowed. But what struck Greene most wasn't Marilyn's beauty or even her untapped talent. It was her business acumen. She understood exactly how the studio system worked, how they owned her image and controlled her career, how the 7-year contract she'd signed in her early 20s had essentially made her studio property until 1961. "They treat me like a prize racehorse," she told him one afternoon. "They feed me, groom me, parade me around, and I don't get any say in which races I run." Greene listened, and then he said something that would change both their lives. "What if you didn't have to run their races anymore?" By December 1954, Marilyn Monroe was at a breaking point. Fox had just forced her into another formulaic musical, There's No Business Like Show Business, where she was stuffed into feathered costumes and expected to sing and dance while the dramatic roles she craved went to other actresses. She called Milton Greene in the middle of the night. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice cracking with exhaustion and pills. "I need to get out, but I don't know how." Greene's response was immediate. "Come to Connecticut, stay with Amy and me. We'll figure it out together." Within days, Marilyn Monroe, the most famous woman in America, was living in a farmhouse in Connecticut with a photographer's family, sleeping in their guest room, eating breakfast with their young son, trying to remember what it felt like to be a person instead of a product. Those months in Connecticut were unlike anything Marilyn had experienced in Hollywood. Greene's wife Amy treated her not as a celebrity but as a friend. And Milton, in his makeshift darkroom in the barn, was developing photographs that would redefine how the world saw her. 50 sessions, thousands of images, each one capturing a facet of Marilyn that Fox's studio photographers had never bothered to explore. But Greene wasn't just taking pictures, he was building a legal strategy. He'd consulted with lawyers about Marilyn's Fox contract and discovered what she'd long suspected: the terms were unconscionable. She was making a fraction of what male stars earned for comparable roles. She had no script approval, no director approval, no creative control whatsoever. "We need to form a corporation," Greene explained one night at his kitchen table. "If you're a business entity instead of just an actress, you have leverage. We create Marilyn Monroe Productions. You own 51%, I own 49%, and we refuse to work for Fox under the current terms." What Greene didn't tell her that night was that he'd already mortgaged his Connecticut home to fund this rebellion. He was risking everything he'd built, his house, his financial security, his family's stability, on the belief that Marilyn Monroe deserved to own her own career. It was a level of faith and sacrifice that Marilyn had never encountered from anyone in Hollywood, where relationships were transactional and loyalty lasted only as long as box office receipts. December 31st, 1954. While most of America was preparing for New Year's Eve celebrations, Marilyn Monroe and Milton Greene were signing legal documents that would shock the entertainment industry. Marilyn Monroe Productions was officially incorporated, with Marilyn holding majority ownership for the first time in her career. Fox executives were furious, other studios were alarmed, but the most interesting response came from other actors who suddenly saw a roadmap for their own liberation from the studio system. The next 2 years were a legal battle that made headlines across the country. Fox insisted Marilyn was under contract. Marilyn's lawyers, funded by Greene's mortgaged house, argued that the contract was exploitative. And while the lawyers fought, Marilyn went to New York and studied at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, proving to critics that she was serious about her craft in ways Hollywood had never allowed her to be. By December 1955, Fox blinked. They offered Marilyn a new contract with revolutionary terms: $400,000 per film, more than triple her previous salary, the right to make one independent film per year, and most significantly, approval rights over her directors and scripts. Marilyn Monroe Productions had won. The first film under the new arrangement was Bus Stop, released in 1956. Critics were stunned. Time magazine called it the most accomplished performance of her career. Marilyn felt vindicated in ways that all her previous box office success had never achieved. Greene's photographs from this period show a woman transformed. In one session, she wore a simple black turtleneck and jeans, her hair pulled back, no makeup, staring directly into the camera with an expression that dared anyone to see her as just a pretty face. These images weren't selling Marilyn Monroe the product. They were documenting Marilyn Monroe the artist, the businesswoman, the majority owner of her own destiny. But success in Hollywood always comes with a price. June 1956. While Marilyn was filming Bus Stop, she fell in love with Arthur Miller, the celebrated playwright who represented everything she'd always wanted to be: intellectual, respected, taken seriously. Miller saw her intelligence, her reading habits, her hunger for knowledge, and Marilyn, desperate for validation from the intellectual world that had always dismissed her, fell hard. They married on June 29, 1956, and Miller accompanied Marilyn to England for the filming of The Prince and the Showgirl. But on the London set, something began to fracture. Laurence Olivier clashed with Marilyn's method acting approach. She would arrive hours late, struggle with lines, require dozens of takes, and while Greene tried to mediate, Arthur Miller was developing a different narrative. He watched the production costs escalate. He saw Marilyn's dependence on pills increasing, and he began to believe that Milton Greene was the problem. The production was over budget. Greene was learning the producer role on the job and making expensive mistakes, but what Miller didn't understand was the bigger picture. Greene had mortgaged his house to give Marilyn this freedom. He was working 18-hour days, trying to balance Olivier's demands, Marilyn's needs, and the studio's budget requirements. He was protecting Marilyn's interests even when she was too drugged to protect them herself. But Arthur Miller was a playwright who understood narrative, and the story he began telling Marilyn was compelling. Milton Greene was using her, taking advantage of her naivety, bleeding her company dry. It didn't matter that Greene's 49% ownership meant he was losing money on every cost overrun. It didn't matter that he'd risked his family's home. What mattered was that Miller, her intellectual husband, was telling her she was being exploited. And Marilyn, who'd spent her entire life being exploited by men, couldn't distinguish between partnership and manipulation anymore. The conversations would happen late at night in their London hotel suite. Miller would show Marilyn the production budgets, point out expenses, ask questions about Greene's financial management. How much is he paying himself? Where is all this money going? And Marilyn, exhausted and desperate to trust her husband, began to doubt the man who'd given her 51% when Hollywood only offered slavery. When Marilyn returned to America, the legal papers were already prepared. Arthur Miller had consulted with lawyers about dissolving Marilyn Monroe Productions. The financial argument seemed straightforward. The company was in debt, and Marilyn, as majority owner, had the right to buy out her partner's 49% stake. What wasn't straightforward was the emotional betrayal. Milton Greene had spent 3 years fighting for Marilyn's independence, mortgaging his home, risking his career, and now she was preparing to erase their partnership. The final meeting happened in early 1957 in a lawyer's office in New York. Milton and Marilyn sat across from each other, 3 years of shared dreams between them. Marilyn would buy out Milton's 49% stake for an amount that barely covered his initial investment. Milton would retain the rights to his photographs, but would have no further involvement. "Is this really what you want?" Milton asked. Marilyn didn't look at him when she answered. "Arthur says it's for the best." And Milton Greene signed the papers that ended their partnership. The aftermath was brutal in its silence. Milton and Marilyn didn't speak for 5 years, not during Some Like It Hot in 1959, not when her marriage to Miller fell apart in 1960, not during The Misfits in 1961, when her dependence on pills escalated. 5 years of silence, while Marilyn spiraled and Milton returned to photography, using his art to process a betrayal he never fully understood. The photographs remained, though, evidence of a partnership that changed Hollywood, even as it destroyed the people who created it. After Marilyn Monroe Productions forced Fox to renegotiate her contract, other stars began demanding similar terms. James Stewart formed his own production company. Kirk Douglas followed. The studio system that had controlled actors since the 1920s began to crumble. Marilyn and Milton's partnership had been a catalyst for that revolution, but while Hollywood celebrated its new freedom, the two people who'd made it possible weren't speaking. Summer 1962. Marilyn Monroe was dying, though few people recognized it yet. Her career was in shambles after being fired from Something's Gotta Give. Her marriage to Miller was long over. Her dependence on barbiturates had escalated to the point where friends feared for her life. And in her Brentwood home, surrounded by pills and loneliness, she thought about Milton Greene. 5 years of silence, 5 years of men making decisions for her. And in those final weeks, Marilyn picked up the phone and dialed a Connecticut number she'd once known by heart. Milton was in his studio when the call came. The voice on the line was barely recognizable, slurred with pills and thick with regret. "Milton," Marilyn whispered, "I should have listened to you." And Milton, who'd spent 5 years processing betrayal, felt his carefully constructed emotional distance shatter. "I know, Marilyn. I know." They talked for over an hour. Marilyn apologized for believing Arthur Miller instead of trusting their partnership, but mostly they talked about the photographs. "You were the only one who saw me as art," Marilyn said, crying. "Everyone else just saw a product." Milton tried to find words that could undo 5 years of silence. "I'm coming to see you," he promised. "We'll talk in person." But they both knew it was a lie. Some betrayals cut too deep. Some partnerships, once shattered, can never be restored. And when Marilyn Monroe was found dead on August 5, 1962, Milton Greene was still in Connecticut, staring at photographs of a woman he'd tried to save but couldn't. After Marilyn's death, Milton Greene rarely discussed their partnership except in technical terms. When reporters asked about their falling out, he would deflect. But the photographs he took between 1953 and 1957 became some of the most valuable images in Hollywood history. Not because of their technical excellence, though they were masterfully executed, but because they captured something the world had never seen: Marilyn Monroe, as she wanted to be seen, as an artist, as a businesswoman, as a human being, with depth and intelligence beyond her famous curves. The tragedy wasn't that the partnership ended. The tragedy was that the dissolution came from manufactured mistrust rather than genuine conflict. Arthur Miller had convinced Marilyn that Milton was exploiting her, when the reality was far more complex. Milton had made mistakes as a producer, but his fundamental motivation had never been exploitation. He'd mortgaged his house, risked his career, spent 3 years fighting the most powerful studio in Hollywood, all because he'd seen something in Marilyn that she didn't see in herself. The 50 sessions and thousands of photographs became Milton Greene's legacy. Museums acquired the prints, galleries exhibited them, and as the decades passed, the images became not just documentation of a star, but evidence of what might have been: a Hollywood where actresses controlled their own careers, where beauty and intelligence weren't mutually exclusive, where a woman could own 51% and use that power to create art. Milton Greene died in 1985, never having fully reconciled with what happened. He'd continued his photography career, achieved success and recognition, but friends noted that he rarely spoke about Marilyn except in technical terms. When he did discuss it, late at night, he would always come back to the same question: why did she believe Arthur instead of the numbers? The financial records proved he hadn't stolen from her. The mortgaged house proved his commitment, but none of that mattered against a husband's whispered accusations. Today, Milton Greene's photographs of Marilyn Monroe sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars at auction, and in every image you can see what made their partnership so extraordinary and its dissolution so tragic. In one session from 1956, Marilyn wore a simple black turtleneck and sat against a plain white background. Just her face, unguarded and intelligent, looking directly into the camera. That photograph captures what Milton Greene gave Marilyn Monroe: the permission to be complex, the space to be intelligent, the freedom to be more than what Hollywood demanded. When Marilyn made that final phone call in the summer of 1962, whispering "I should have listened to you" through a haze of pills and regret, she wasn't just apologizing for a business decision, she was acknowledging that she'd let go of the only partnership where she'd ever held real power, where a man had given her 51% instead of demanding control, where for 3 brief years Marilyn Monroe had been more than what Hollywood made her. "I know, Marilyn," Milton had said, crying in his Connecticut studio. "I know." It was all he could say. Some partnerships, once shattered, can never be restored. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness. Some phone calls come 5 years too late, but the photographs remain, evidence of what was, proof of what might have been, documentation of the moment when Marilyn Monroe owned 51% of her own destiny. The partnership may have died in 1957, destroyed by manufactured mistrust. But the images will survive as long as people remember Marilyn Monroe, and in every photograph you can see what Hollywood tried to bury: that once, briefly, she was free,